andando entre Belém e Marabá e não conseguiu chegar a lugar nenhum.
How could a perfectly functioning plane, flying in excellent weather conditions with a trained crew communicating normally with air traffic controllers, simply disappear in the middle of the Amazon rainforest? Understand the accident involving Varig Flight 254, which crashed more than 1,000 kilometers off its planned route. This intriguing story begins on a flight between Sao Paulo and Belém. Departing from Sao Paulo at 9:43 a.m. on September 3, 1989, the flight had scheduled stops in Uberaba, Uberlândia, Goiânia, Brasília, Imperatriz, and Marabá. The flight was to be operated by a Boeing 737-200, manufactured in 1975, an aircraft that was still modern by the standards of the time. Interestingly, these aircraft became known in Brazil as breguinha, meaning tacky or cheap, since during the period of the introduction of the newer, more modern version of the Boeing 737-300, with new engines and LCD screens in the cockpit, Brazilian TV was broadcasting the soap opera Brega e Chica, meaning tacky and chic, and the older model earned the affectionate nickname Breguinha. Returning to Flight 254, the last leg of this flight between Marabá and Belém should have been flown north with the compass indicating a heading of 07 degrees. The flight departed at 17:54, just before sunset. The Marabá Airport runway is oriented north-south, and after takeoff, a slight left turn would be necessary to reach a heading of 027. However, the crew inadvertently made a much longer turn and, after crossing heading 027, continued a turn westward. Inspired by a newly introduced company document that added a digit to the left of the flight plan, the crew in the cockpit took off with a heading of 270, flying directly west. This new document had been introduced by Varg to allow for greater precision on long-haul flights over the Atlantic Ocean. At that time, Varg had Boeing 747s, 707s, and DC-10s operating flights to North America, Europe, and Asia, crossing the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. To more accurately cover sections without radar or instrument coverage, a digit would be added as the decimal place of the headings to be flown. For standardization, it was also used on short-haul flights. After flying the estimated time to Belém, the pilots descended seeking visual contact with the city. Unable to locate Belém, they initially made a 180-degree turn to return to Marabá. But without guidance and certainty of the navigation they had followed so far, they attempted to navigate south. At this point, the pilots were no longer able to communicate with Belém and used other aircraft in the area to act as a communication link with the airport. Authorization to land was granted. The pilots still had no visual contact with the city of Belém, and in an attempt to obtain some indication of the city's location, they tried an unusual and unconventional practice. They tried to tune into radio frequencies in the city of Belém. One of these radios was broadcasting a football game, but the signal was not strong enough to give an indication to the instruments. On the second attempt, they succeeded in tuning into a radio station broadcasting a mass, and the pilots deduced that this indication was the heading for Belém. However, the radio station they had tuned into was located in Barra do Garças. To add to the disorientation, a river was sighted, and the pilots imagined that it was the Tocantins River, which passes through Belém. However, it was the Xingu River. With the radio indication and visual reference of the river, the pilots inferred that they were on the right track. However, both indications were incorrect. An unfortunate coincidence was the atmospheric condition that allowed the Barra do Garça radio station to be tuned into. Despite being out of range of the aircraft, radio waves reflected off the atmosphere and returned clearly to the aircraft. The pilots maintained a lower altitude than a usual cruising flight, hoping to obtain some visual reference that would allow navigation. However, this contributed to higher fuel consumption. Shortly before the fuel ran out, the captain announced the emergency situation to the passengers.
Senhores passageiros, o comandante que vos fala. Tivemos uma pane de desorientação do nosso sistema de bússola. Estamos com o nosso combustível já no final, ainda com 15 minutos. Pedimos a todos que mantenham a calma, porque uma situação como essa realmente foi difícil de acontecer. Deixamos a todos com a esperança de que isso não passe de apenas um susto para todos nós. Atenção, muito obrigado e todos.
Due to the distance, the pilots were unable to communicate with the Belém Tower. However, it was possible to communicate with Varg flights 231 and 266, which were flying in the region.
De Belém, a bússola estava com outra proa, a gente ficou andando entre Belém e Marabá e não conseguiu chegar a lugar nenhum. Agora está indo para Marabá e não tem mais combustível para ir para lugar nenhum, entendeu? O motor acabou de parar, a gente vai ter que descer agora. Eu vou poder falar mais que a gente vai se preparar aqui depois, ok? Pressão de titulação é alta depois de passar.
After the engines failed due to lack of fuel, the pilots glided the plane and made a forced landing in the Amazon rainforest near São José do Xingu, located more than 1,100 kilometers from Belém and in a completely opposite direction from the initial flight plan. Of the 54 people on board, 42 survived. Because the accident occurred completely off the flight path, the search was conducted in areas near Belém and Marabá. Only the day after the forced landing did the pilots emerge from the wreckage in search of help and find a farm where they finally managed to get assistance. Among the factors that were credited at the time as contributing to the accident, the unconfirmed influence of a football match stands out. On that same date, Brazil was playing against Chile in Rio de Janeiro, seeking qualification for the 1990 World Cup. There were reports that the pilots were tuned to local radio frequencies listening to the match, and that this may have contributed to the navigation error. However, this comment was refuted by the pilots who survived the accident. The Vargi Flight 254 accident remains one of the most intriguing in world aviation. After the investigations were concluded, pilots from airlines around the world underwent a test. They retraced the steps of the pilot and co-pilot of Flight 254. Of the 21 pilots, 15 made the same error in interpreting the flight plan. A combination of denial, confirmation bias, and bad luck determined the fate of the flight. As a result, improvements to the flight plan were implemented to prevent other accidents like this. Vargi implemented a new, more modern navigation system in its aircraft. New training standards and adherence to procedures were also implemented. The catastrophic end of this flight, with the loss of 12 lives, also resulted in actions that prevented similar events from occurring in the future. Leave a comment if you already knew about this accident and suggestions for future videos. If you like this content, give a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more videos like this.